We're going to get this next session started. I see lots of familiar names that were just in the session prior, so I appreciate folks who are sticking with us throughout the whole day. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the Deputy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities, and I want to welcome you to this session. The CAHC is 3 days of amazing content. You're in day 2, and we're really looking forward to this session and another day and a half of amazing sessions. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2022 and follow us at PSC Housing on Twitter if you aren't already. This session is entitled Work, Live, Ride, Transit-Oriented Communities. And before we turn over presenters, I just have a couple of opening remarks for you. I want to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, La Rosa Building Group, the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. Their support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. Thank you to our collaborating sponsors and our armful of supporting sponsors that have helped keep this conference free to attendees this year. Thank you. And last but not least, thank you to the sponsors for this session, Blue Hub Capital and Santander. A quick note that registration is now open for our final I-Forum of the year, Tenant-Based Subsidies in Connecticut, Equitable Expansion. It will take place on Tuesday, December 6th from 10 to 12 p.m. and will feature an overview of tenant-based housing subsidy programs in Connecticut, who accesses these programs, the deep positive impact housing subsidies have on households' quality of life, and how we can work to ensure equitable expansion of housing subsidies. So I will drop the link to register for that event in the chat in just a moment. And with that, I will turn it over to Pete Harrison, and I'll get your slides shared, Pete.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Just as we're getting the slides started here, I just want to say thanks to the partnership for inviting us to participate in this. This has been a great event. Always excited to see this group of folks come together. Particular thanks to Chelsea for running our slides. I had some kind of computer issue, as one inevitably does for Zoom. So thank you for that. So thanks everybody. We're on day 2 of the conference, and we are Desegregate Connecticut, and we are here to talk about transit-oriented communities, the past, present, and future of making a home in Connecticut, and to introduce our broader framework of work, live, ride. Next slide. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of DesegregateCT. I'm joined with a couple of colleagues today. Rachel Elke, who's our senior policy fellow, is going to be talking about some of our research, and Sydney Elke, who's our TOC organizer, who's going to talk about some of the organizing work on the ground that we've done last year. Next slide. The quick introduction, or sorry, agenda. So we are going to talk about Connecticut having been and will be again a work, live, ride state. We are going to talk about the research that we've done over the last couple of years and currently and forthcoming to make that claim. And we are going to talk about the work that we've done on the ground, building power to pass work, live, ride in this upcoming legislative session. And if we time it correctly, we should have ample time for questions at the end. If you have a question during the presentation with any of those speakers, throw it in the chat and we'll make sure to get to it. We want to hear from everybody about the work, live, ride framework. So excited to have that part of the discussion. Next slide. So Desegregate Connecticut, we are a pro-homes coalition of about 80 neighborhood and nonprofit groups. We are dedicated to seeing better zoning laws at the local and state level to make a more equitable and sustainable and prosperous Connecticut. Next slide. Our coalition is our strength. We have all kinds of experiences from small neighborhood groups, anti-racism groups, to larger nonprofit groups, including partnership, across all kinds of issues, across all kinds of geographies of Connecticut, to give us a voice at the state level, but also to advocate at the local level for the kinds of changes that we want to see. Next slide. So our Pro-Homes Coalition, we've adopted what we call an all-of-the-above approach to solving Connecticut's housing crisis. And really what that means in a nutshell is, number one, we need to build more kinds of homes, whether it's for homeowners, for home renters, publicly owned, privately owned, all the spectrum, we need more of them in Connecticut. Second, we need to act at all levels of government. It starts at the planning and zoning, at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level, and increasingly coordinating at the federal level. And finally, that means working in and with diverse coalitions. We're excited about the nature of our coalition. We're also excited about participating in other groups and other experts. Some of you on this call are way more experienced in your particular field. We want to learn from you and incorporate your work, and vice versa, to make sure that all of us that care about solving the housing crisis are working in concert together to the same ends. Next slide. So how do we have this all the above approach in practice? We think that it is through this framework of work, live, ride. And before getting into some specifics here, at the 30,000-foot view, we think this is a vision for a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable Connecticut. It is specifically also a policy framework for aligning local and state planning goals. We think this will be the first of many versions of work, live, ride in the years ahead. And finally, most importantly, it is a call to action for you and folks individually as organizations to be the change that you want to see in your community at the local level, but also at the state level. Next slide. So the vehicle for work, live, ride in Connecticut, as anyone is familiar with DesegregateCT's work over the last year or so, is transit-oriented communities. And just very quickly, transit-oriented community or transit-oriented development is a planning concept that calls for more homes and more services within walking distance of transit stations. That works out to about a half-mile radius or about a 10-minute walk. So that's the framework, the vehicle that we want to propose work, live, ride through. Next slide. The benefits of transit-oriented communities are many. We'll highlight a couple here in the course of the presentation. But number one, it centers riders and pedestrians over cars and car infrastructure. Two, it offers a diversity of homes, jobs, and services all within walking distance. And three, it creates exciting and most importantly, sustainable places that we want to spend time in, we want to work in, we want to live in, and we want to be together in. Next slide. Something to emphasize here that shouldn't be lost, New England character is transit-oriented. Our most successful and beloved communities in Connecticut were designed around transit. Might have been a river, a canal, a train, but they were designed to be walkable, diverse use cases, and device homing. So we have a legacy in Connecticut as one of the first industrialized states to have this kind of infrastructure in place. We think the character of New England that so many folks want to defend should be defending the idea of transit-oriented community and reviving this as a concept that's already successful in Connecticut and part of what we love about the state. Next slide. The other thing we should emphasize that may come as a shock to some folks, but Connecticut today, right now, is transit rich. Over 110 communities are transit connected, whether through local bus service, rapid bus service, or train lines. That's 2/3 of Connecticut towns and cities have some transit infrastructure already. That translates to over 42 million annual bus rides across CT Transit and independent systems, and 40 million annual rail rides, particularly, of course, along Metro North in the shoreline. That is numbers, the bus numbers are from 2021, so during COVID and after. The rail numbers come from 2019. We know both of those numbers dipped. Bus ridership's already back. Rail ridership is probably not going to come back to the same level, but that's an opportunity, we think, to rethink the transit system and get those numbers up in a different way. Next slide. So getting to the specifics of the Work, Live, Ride Act that we're proposing, I will preface this by saying today is really a teaser. We have not publicly put out the final presentation. That will come later. Today, we're really trying to give folks that maybe not as familiar with our coalition and some of these conversations so far a good overview of what we're proposing and working on currently. The top three things to know about the Work, Live, Ride Act. One is it's about incentives. We want to incentivize good local planning and development in an existing or created TOC district along a bus route, a train route, or whatever. Second, we want to invest discretionary state funding in three different buckets within this zone. One is on the front end of planning and development. Two is on the actual infrastructure necessary to see these developed coherently, whether it's pedestrian safety or water and sewer infrastructure, all of the above. And third, and hopefully most importantly, we actually want to help coordinate funding for home creation, particularly deeply affordable home creation within these districts. And the final vehicle to do this is coordinating state resources through an existing office, the Office of Responsible Growth in OPM, that's already trying to do this work in many cases, but needs a little bit extra help coordinating at the state level. So that's the broad framework. Next slide. Some of the specifics we've identified of good planning practices at different criteria. The thing I want to highlight for today's purposes is we have designed the proposal to be recognizing the different tiers and realities on the ground of different towns and cities' infrastructure. So we've had three basic tiers of communities. The first is rapid transit community. That is a town or city with at least one rail/rapid bus or bus service. We've sub-tiered that into different population levels. The second is transit communities. That's a town or city that has at least one bus route. And finally, the transit adjacent communities, a town or city directly bordering an RTC or a TC. In total, there are basically only 6 communities that don't fall under one of these standards. So we think this is something that can be transformative across the state, but also tiered specifically to the conditions on the ground, given a population and transit infrastructure. Next slide. So we think Work, Live, Ride is a tool for addressing the housing crisis, both in the long run, but specifically immediately. First, it creates an all government urgency and accountability to act. There are many different agencies trying to tackle this, many different local governments trying to do a little bit of everything. We think that coordinating through Work, Live, Ride gives an all government approach to coordinate all activity to make sure we're being direct, thoughtful, and accountable to making sure that we're building enough housing. Second is we are focusing, including on deeply affordable housing. The final result of this might be a smaller percentage of overall affordable housing, but what we'd like to target is that 0 to 50% AMI. That's harder for the private market to get, harder to get through on existing inclusionary zoning frameworks. So we're trying to make this a deeply affordable part of the proposal. And finally, more broadly, from the broader philosophical argument, is we're trying to reject this reactionary regime in Connecticut of this one-size-fits-all housing stock, which Rachel will talk about in the research section. We're also trying to reject this sprawl-enforced zoning regime that we have across the state by coordinating our efforts and focusing development in the places that we want to see development. Next slide. We also think that Work, Live, Ride is about something bigger and something harder, I think, for folks in Connecticut necessary to see. We want to think of a positive, exciting vision for the future of Connecticut. We want to have freedom from car dependency and car infrastructure. We want to protect our health, our children's health, and the natural spaces that we love that are fighting climate change. And we want to present faith in our state's economic and civic future. We are experimenting with how to describe that without freaking people out. But we really do believe that something like a 5 by 50, Connecticut should have 5 million residents by 2050. If we put in the work now, we can solve the immediate housing crisis, but we can also lay the foundation for seeing Connecticut benefit and grow in a way that we haven't seen in 40 or 50 years. So we're gonna own the fact that this is a positive vision of the future potential of Connecticut while addressing the immediate affordable housing crisis we're all desperately trying to face. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to give a sense of what Work, Live, Ride is specifically trying to solve in terms of land use issues in Connecticut. Rachel?
Thank you, Pete. So I'm going to be giving a broad level overview of the need for Work, Live, Ride and some of the research efforts so far that have led up to our proposal. Next slide, please. So there are a range of issues with our current zoning, as you all know, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to be reviewing 3 regulations here. Next slide. So one of the biggest issues we've seen with zoning in Connecticut and in a lot of other places, to be fair, is minimum lot sizes. So when we put together the zoning atlas, we did definitely find the one-size-fits-all housing that Pete mentioned earlier. What I mean by that is 81% of our residential land had minimum lot sizes of roughly an acre or more. And 40% of all of the towns in Connecticut require 1.8 acres or more on over half of their land. And to put that into perspective, 1.8 acres is just under 1.5 football fields, and that is per home. That kind of zoning really limits choice for people who live in the neighborhood and also for people who want to live in it. It makes developing land much more expensive, and in doing so, those costs are passed on. So what it ends up doing is increasing housing costs for everyone. Next slide. Another issue is high parking minimums. So we know that high parking minimums add to greenhouse gases by increasing reliance on cars and encouraging sprawl. They also make areas less walkable because development has to be much more spaced out to allow for the large amounts of required parking. And as we know from our research along the New Haven line, this is particularly damaging for the tax base near transit, where land tends to be more valuable. Next slide. And also, as we know from the atlas, single-family housing by right is the dominant majority by far of the kind of housing that's allowed in Connecticut. So what these restrictions do essentially, again, is add costs and time and money to get the project built, the multifamily housing built, if it ever does get built, right? And that remains an open question on a lot of these projects with the way the zoning regulations currently are. And again, those extra costs from meeting those regulations are passed on to renters and buyers in the form of higher housing costs. Next. Work, Live, Ride really tries to address several of these issues by incentivizing compact development within a half mile of transit. And by increasing housing type choice, we really believe that people should get to decide where they live, and a real choice by making it more affordable by building more housing and more businesses and more mixed use development. And also by growing towns' tax bases. We want to bring in new residents. We want to make these areas places where people really want to live and where there are amenities. And there's also the benefit of, potentially rewarding towns that have submitted or will submit affordable housing plans, or that have already done a significant amount of work. So areas that already have substantial transit-oriented development. Next slide. So after the transit-oriented community brief, the brief that I just mentioned some results of, we held walk audits, and those began in March 2021. Basically, what we were trying to do was get qualitative research in addition to the quantitative research. And we wanted to look at development in neighborhoods around transit. Sydney will go into that in a bit more detail. We have also been researching local bus lines, so both independently owned and the CT Fast Track system. We've been mapping parking lots along specifically the New Haven line of Metro North. We know from our research that the area within a half mile of transit tends to be more valuable than the area outside of it. So we really wanted to think about, how are we using this land? Should we be devoting all of it to parking, or are there possibly more economically productive uses? Could we divert that to other uses where the tax dollars could even be used to fund resiliency efforts near these stations where flooding has become a serious issue? And so that's been a part of our research as well. Next slide. So Pete mentioned the tiers that we're looking to do for Work, Live, Ride. So you can see an example of that here in the under 25,000. And so the Norotan Heights station of Darien would be classed as a rapid transit community under this system. And to give you a little bit of background, we began a lot of our recent rail research by looking at the New Haven line, and that's obviously vital to the economy of Connecticut and to the region as a whole. But it's dealing with substantial financial challenges that are pushing back needed repairs and updates. And if that's something you're interested in learning a little bit more about, I highly recommend checking out RPA's Getting Back on Track report, which talks about some of those missed opportunities. So, oh, I'm sorry, can you go back? Thank you. So you'll see here on the right, this is some of the parking lot research that I did around Norotan Heights, just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek. But to speak more generally about the station, there's a big development project happening to the north. There's also social housing just off the fields, which is an example of how public-private partnership can help in this fight to mitigate the housing crisis. They also have a grocery store within walking distance of the station, which is obviously a necessity if you really want people to live there. And although Darien has a small amount of affordable housing, about 264 units as of the walk audit, the units are concentrated near transit. So those who live in affordable units have easier access to the train. The flip side of that, of course, is that when all of your affordable housing is located solely in one area, you're still sort of limiting housing choice for lower income residents. Overall, Darien still needs much more housing and mixed use development near transit, particularly for seniors and low income families, and in general to make the area around the train more bikeable and pedestrian friendly. Next slide. About a month ago, we had our walk audit in Waterbury, and to offer some background, back in 2016, Waterbury made its zoning code much less strict and more open to development and removed parking requirements downtown. It has 20% affordable housing as of right, with mixed use zoning downtown where many apartments are located above ground floor businesses. And Waterbury's downtown is about a 2-minute walk away from its train station. So there are definitely a lot of assets there, but there are also challenges related to environmental cleanup near the station that prohibits some types of development. Next slide. And West Hartford. So West Hartford has a walkable downtown and 2 CT fast track stations. You'll see in this picture, which is looking north to Elmwood, the Elmwood fast track station. It doesn't look very walkable here, but there are some areas that are more walkable. So this summer, they've just zoned for transit-oriented development within a 1/4 mile of those stations, and we're definitely looking forward to seeing what happens in West Hartford. Next slide. Bethel, who we've worked with a lot, are classed under this system as a rapid transit community of under 25,000. And it's an example of a town that's really done a lot of work and planning to advance transit-oriented development. They have a pedestrian-friendly downtown, several multifamily developments within walking distance of the station, and each of those have some deed-restricted affordable units. They've also upzoned some areas around the station to allow for ADUs, duplexes, and triplexes under certain conditions. And there are more projects in the works, including bike lanes and new mixed income homes, and also a pedestrian bridge that would connect both sides of the Metro North train tracks. But one thing that we've seen in small towns like Bethel, who really want and are very invested in advancing transit-oriented development, is that getting funding, the ability to get funding is really limiting what they can do. And having the resources to get grants from the state is time-consuming and difficult. And now I'm going to pass it off to Sydney, who will be speaking about some of our organizing work for transit-oriented communities so far.
Thank you, Rachel. So as you all can see, we have based the Work, Live, Ride Act not only in extensive research, but also on the results of extensive organizing. So we've done a lot of these transit-oriented community walk audits to emphasize the local and state level work around transit-oriented communities. I'm just going to talk broadly about the purpose and format of the walks, as well as how it informs our confidence with regards to Work, Live, Ride. We've organized all of these via a grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, so thanks to them for that. Next slide. So we've really had clear goals in hosting our walk audits, and we were purposeful in focusing on communities that have already made transit-oriented districts or are either planning to or doing the work around transit stations. We're really trying to promote the idea that this is an existing concept and people are working for this on the ground. We also want to point out the challenges that many towns face, particularly that funding for via state grants is very difficult and confusing to apply for, and the fact that many towns struggle to access the necessary technical assistance to create transit-oriented districts. We think that this is a really great opportunity for the state of Connecticut to play a tangible role in the development of future TODs by clearly providing grant applications and technical assistance to the towns that want to build transit-oriented communities and are actively looking for this assistance. We'll do more of these and probably pivot to the communities who have not done this work to understand how Work, Live, Ride might be able to help them create more transit communities going forward. Next slide. So we've done about a dozen walks in 10 communities of all sizes, attended by hundreds of people since March of 2021. We've partnered with a lot of nonprofits to plan these walks, such as the Center for Latino Progress, FCCHO, Team Inc., and the Naugatuck Valley Project. Many local government officials, such as economic and development departments, planning and zoning commissioners, mayors, town councils, state representatives and senators, and even Congress members have participated, which really proves that there's a demand for these sort of communities across the state, as well as support at all levels of government. The people of Connecticut really want transit-oriented communities, and many of them have taken active steps to build them in their own towns. Now what they really need is state support. Next slide. So in order to plan these block audits, there's a few relatively simple steps. First is that we invite stakeholders such as government and elected leaders, business and faith communities, nonprofits and activists, and other community members. Then we conduct the walks by filling out AARP worksheets, highlighting land use, housing stock, transportation infrastructure, and pedestrian experiences. And then the next steps are hosting workshops and developing a call to action, which often relates to our development of the Work, Live, Ride Act. Thankfully, these aren't scary like the IRS audits. We did not pick this name, but we really do these walks to see what towns are doing well and what they might be able to do better. And we found really a lot of impressive work being done by communities across our state. Next slide. So we also have resources that we've created for our future walks because we really want to empower people to advocate for themselves and their own communities. This is on the TOC page of our website, and a lot of other groups are actually interested in planning their own walks. So if you're interested in doing one in your own community, we would love to partner with you. We will also be holding a future event on the walk audit brief that Rachel mentioned relatively soon, where we're going to go over our findings from the walk audits and in significantly more detail and discuss how they relate to the Work, Live, Ride Act. Next slide. So we already know that towns of all sizes want to build transit-oriented communities. There's really a demand for this. At least 12 towns have the beginnings of TOCs already, and many more are planning them. People really want them, and we want to make sure that they're able to do so via the Work, Live, Ride legislation. The state makes this process pretty convoluted, and it is very difficult for towns to get the resources that they need to create transit-oriented districts. This is really an opportunity for the state to become a leader by providing accessible funding and technical assistance that transit towns can use to make their own TODs in the future. Next slide. And I will pass this back to Pete.
Thanks, Sydney, and thanks, Rachel. So I just want to wrap up with a little bit of a timeline of what's next for Work, Live, Ride. Right now, we are finalizing the draft of the proposal with our coalition, and we will likely have that done by December, just before the legislative session starts in January. We are continuing to solidify buy-in from key stakeholders, particularly on the state agency line, having some really productive conversations, pressuring folks in certain agencies in the administration, but having really good feedback, particularly from practitioners on the ground, even folks who maybe were a soft opposition last session to 5429, really encouraging steps so far. And then finally, once the session starts, we're going to launch, of course, the campaign and the proposal and work really hard to get Work, Live, Ride passed this year. We think the timing of the need for urgent action on the housing crisis, the fact that the elections have, I think, deflated concerns about some zoning reform, gives us this opportunity to think in a bigger way what we want to see Connecticut to be like. And we are really encouraging folks that are maybe not already in our coalition or haven't previously had a chance or opportunity to work with us to reach out to us in the next few weeks as we're planning this proposal and tweaking it. We want to see a coordinated effort across the entire state to adopt this framework and this policy proposal. So we're actively looking for feedback and buy-in from folks within this conference and across the state. So that's basically what we have on our Work, Live, Ride proposal so far. As I said, it was just a teaser for today, but we're really interested to get questions and feedback from folks on this call. So right now, if you have a question, I guess maybe Chelsea, you can stop sharing the screen. We can jump into the chat and sort of take them in the order as they come in. I think one question we anticipated was, when can we see the draft of the proposal? As I said, we're working on that right now with the coalition and a couple of key stakeholders. But if you're interested, you can certainly email one of us on the presentation to get that feedback. I'm not sure, Brian, I get the, there might have been a typo. Hopefully that's not your rent. Hey, Kathy. So we are CT-based developers who have a TOD that encompasses 223 acres along Route 8. We'll provide hundreds and hundreds of housing units. Would like to discuss in more detail. Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to connect. We've done, as Sydney mentioned, we did the walk in Waterbury, of course, along the Waterbury branch line in Route 8. We also did a walk in Derby. Shelton and Derby are particularly leading a lot of the zoning efforts in the Valley and building a lot of homes. So we're really encouraged by some of the work that's been happening there and some of the discussions that Team Inc. and Naugatuck Valley Project are leading that we're a part of as well. So I think a lot of the pressure, and because of that, the focus at the state level is development in lower Fairfield County. And that's where, it gets very complicated. But there are plenty of parts of the state, whether they're on the rail lines or not, that are, again, from our research and walk audits, really interested in this kind of work and just need technical assistance. And particularly on the private development side, I mentioned this, but one of the buckets we really want to see state coordination on is actual subsidy of deeply affordable housing and production there. So certainly want to have that conversation. Hey, Rana, great to see you. Yeah, let's connect after this. Happy to send the proposal, get feedback. Newington Junction was one of our walk audits. And we're really pleased to see, I think that benefited a lot of folks in the community that might have been concerned about what scale of development are we talking about when it's really locally driven and scale that really fits the character of existing communities. Sean, I see a question. Can you talk about the messaging you anticipate from known housing opponents and how advocates can respond? Yeah, great question. Admittedly, Sean and others, we debated including the 5 by 50 slide of saying we think Connecticut should be 5 million people. So I'll start there. But we think that what's often missing in messaging about Connecticut is this broader narrative and this vision for what we're fighting for. Oftentimes, as you well know and others, in these planning and zoning meetings, it's, maybe a developer against a homeowner or homeowners. That's just not representative of the folks that would benefit from the homes being created and the broader vision of what Connecticut means. So we think elevating the conversation outside of the specific, maybe wonky details or site-by-site developments into a broader argument of what does it mean to grow homes? What is the vision we're talking about here? And filling that vacuum that gets filled in with skyscrapers in the suburbs or dog whistling, all this stuff, with a really concrete sense of a very inclusive, exciting future for Connecticut. So that's kind of where we're starting. But particularly for folks that have opposed some of the TOC work we've done previously, a lot of the lessons that I think we learned that were good faith was this idea that the previous proposal was kind of a one size fits all that doesn't necessarily take the specific characteristics of different stations. We've addressed that proactively to say there are differences in population and transit infrastructure. Let's put some proposals together that work for those folks. We think, again, that it's not about mandates, it's about incentives. There's so many communities in Connecticut that want to see this kind of development. Oftentimes the arguments are these really high opponent areas of the state. Not to say that we'll ever give up on doing more in those communities, but we want to elevate the communities that are doing the work and are interested in that. So we think this is a very positive message, addresses a lot of the good faith concerns folks have had about TOCs, but also just a broader vision that we think is very exciting. Okay, oops, sorry, lost here. Maybeth, hey Maybeth, can you share which CT towns are embracing work, live, ride the best and what that is? I'm specifically interested in bikeable communities. Yeah, I mean, as we said, this is really an intention to center pedestrians and riders, be it train riders or bike riders. And we think because Connecticut is, of course, a small state, it's highly industrialized over 200 years. There's a lot of these great communities that are already dense and walkable that we just want to see more infrastructure and more development in. So, there are dozens of communities, as Sydney pointed out and Rachel pointed out, that have already done some level of TOD district, whether they fit in the confines of our specific proposals, they'd be grandfathered in. But this is something that's already happening, historically has already happened. So again, we think the narrative focusing on places that are doing this work, excited about it, or interested in it, makes a lot more sense in this environment than trying to shove it down throats of communities that are still kind of getting there. We still need to do some work on. Emily, great to see you. Stanford recently expanded TOD zoning, true. Any suggestions on how to handle gentle anti-development pushback when it comes to specific projects in the areas? Yeah, that's a great question. And really, we have to acknowledge that development pressures mean different things in different communities. And there are good faith concerns about gentrification and displacement, particularly in our cities in Connecticut. Obviously, in south side of Stamford comes up. So I think it's incumbent upon pro-homes advocates to make this positive case, make this inclusive case, acknowledge there are trade-offs and there are needs to protect existing homeowners, existing home renters, to make sure that this is an inclusive vision. As I mentioned, we're trying to figure out what this affordability equation looks like given inflationary concerns and deep affordability. We're constantly working with affordable housing advocates right now to piece that together. We've incorporated a lot of activists and community members that have these concerns. Part of it's education and excitement, but part of it is acknowledging that there potentially are trade-offs in certain communities, and we can do more to protect existing home renters, particularly in Connecticut. And that's certainly the intention of Work, Live, Ride. I might be pronouncing this wrong. I apologize. We need communities where TOD zoning is in place. We still face pushback from residents fearing impacts of construction. Okay, yeah, very similar question. There is this, I think, narrative void that people, it's not anything more than I'm afraid of change because I don't know what that looks like. And a lot of our advocacy work and organizing work is really to fill that vacuum with very tangible examples of communities in Connecticut that are doing actual TOD zoning. And Berlin, Connecticut comes to mind. One of the pictures from the slides is there. It's 3-story developments. It's commercial on the first floor, deeply affordable housing on the second, and market rate on the third. We're trying to fill that vacuum of saying these kinds of developments aren't scary. They're benefiting existing residents. Kids that have grown up can't come back and start their careers in town. Seniors that want to downsize. Folks that teach and put out fires in communities. So we think the more that we switch that paradigm from it's a developer or land use lawyer versus homeowners into it's residents of Connecticut and future residents of Connecticut that benefit from this versus anti-homes, small fraction of folks that are either crotchety for abstract reasons or crotchety for worse reasons, that the balance is really more people want to see these positive changes, and we just need to bring them to the table to elevate those voices. So we really think that the walk audits have been really great, as Rachel said, about bringing some qualitative data to the conversation, getting folks out that maybe are freaked out about this stuff. And I can assure you, after some of these walks, it's like, oh, okay, I get how our community can benefit from this. I get how in the long run, actually traffic will be less bad if we have more people walking, is a big argument. So we do think these walk audits have been a profoundly positive impact on these. And that's why Sydney mentioned we're going to continue doing these. Kathy, our property has Metro North Waterbury line directly adjacent. Oh, this is back to the previous thing. Yeah, definitely happy to have some conversations about that. Rachel, if you want to mention, you've alluded to a little bit of the land value data that we've worked on and some of the parking lot data. I want to turn over to you too, because some of the argument we didn't necessarily emphasize today was the climate impacts of TOC. proposals, particularly along the shoreline where there's flooding. So I don't know, Rachel, if you just want to highlight, this idea you mentioned about we need to fund climate resiliency projects, and these areas around stations are really the vehicle to do that. I don't know if you want to add to that quickly.
Yeah. So, a lot of the Metro North stations are dealing with flooding. In particular, the New Haven line, which I focused in on, and also the shoreline are just dealing with a lot of flooding. And there are questions about how you fund resiliency improvements across those sort of large areas. And we think that the increased tax revenue from really encouraging more businesses and housing there could help fund some of those resiliency efforts. So that's an idea that we're really excited about and interested in hearing your feedback about. And Vanita, I did want to speak to one point that you made in the chat. You were talking about fears of being priced out in communities where TOD is currently in place. And I do want to point out, when you're in conversation with those people, the best protection against being pushed out is supporting upzoning across the entire state. And spot upzoning is not as effective as doing upzoning across the entire state, and they have had research that supports that. This is a good start, but it's certainly not the end. And I believe that I haven't attended the walk audits because I live about 5 hours away, although I'm a Connecticut native. But I believe that in some of the notes I saw similar issues being brought up. Maybe Sydney or Pete can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, just quickly, I'll turn it over to Sydney to give a little teaser about some of the walks we've got coming up. Different parts of the state have different development pressures, and because zoning and development is so hard to do, it does come down to these site by site, project by project, massive fights. And we think the way to really alleviate that pressure in certain communities is this above board statewide effort to encourage development where particularly there's a political will locally to do so. So, whether it's development in Danbury or Stamford or displacement concerns in certain parts of cities, we think the answer is, again, encouraging development everywhere. If it's only allowed in certain pockets, developers, whether they're good actors or not so great actors, are going to try to push through that kind of work, and that's not necessarily reflective of the needs in a lot of other types of communities and the benefits for other types of communities. So I don't know, Sydney, if you just want to tease out, we're obviously planning some more walks, particularly to address this issue too. So if you want to give a little tease of some of the stuff we're at least thinking about still in the planning phase.
Yeah, of course. So there's a couple locations where we might do these walk audits in the near future, such as on Shoreline East, the New Haven line, possibly Fast Track in New Britain or Guilford. We're also thinking about ideally doing some around just fixed bus lines so that we can really explore how the Work, Live, Ride Act might impact the bus towns that we haven't really organized around as much as we would like to really understand how expanding the scope of this legislation could create transit-oriented districts throughout the state, not only on the train lines or the rapid bus.
I think we're kind of getting down to it here, but yeah, really, we're excited about this framework. Our team's really excited and working really hard on it. We want to work with all of you. We're absolutely want the feedback and insights for the experts on this call and this conference. But we think this is the right framework at the right time to help the immediate housing crisis, but also the long-term implications of climate change, economic inequality, and racial segregation, which is really the core of our work. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and certainly hope to keep in touch with folks. We'll follow up. Our emails are in the slides here, but do want to continue some of these conversations offline. So thanks so much. And thanks, Chelsea, for spot starting on the slides. We included the Bank Street picture, knowing that you grew up in Waterbury, and wanted to give a little shout out incidentally, and that worked out nicely. So
Thanks. Yep. I grew up on Bank Street. Thanks, Pete. And thanks, Rachel and Sydney. If you can drop your emails in the chat since we stopped sharing the slides with your emails, I'll also attach the slide deck with your permission to the session so folks can access it for future reference. And right now, flood planning and mitigation for affordable housing organizations is starting in the next Zoom room. So you can go, we talked a little bit about flooding today, so go over and learn something about flood planning. And we'll see you for the plenary session at 12:30, ensuring equitable restoration for communities of color. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Rachel.